Hi guys, I am here with a true story. This will be the last one for tonight because I'll have to put the camera back on the charger. So the quote before this one is by G.K. Chesterton. Tremendous Trifles says, "The world will never starve for want of wonders, but only for want of wonder." And these stories are called Bending the Rules. Lou Baker is not the only person to experience a suspension of the laws of physics, and since God made the universe, he can surely bend its rules whenever he chooses. 18-year-old Bill Clark of Stacksburg, New York, discovered this when he went to work for some family friends who install air conditioning systems. Bill was a gopher, someone who ran around the site picking up items and bringing them to the installers. His mother Martha was pleased with Bill's emerging maturity, but like many parents, she was having a little trouble letting go. "Every day I asked God to reassure me that I had done a good job getting Bill ready for the adult world," she says. On one extremely hot day, Bill and his two bosses were installing air conditioning in a large luxury home. They had already dragged 110-volt lines through the attic ducts, and now they were working outside near the home's in-ground pool. "Bill," the boss called, "plug in that extension cord and bring it to me." Bill did as he was told. Then he walked backward toward his boss, unwinding the cord as he went. No one saw Bill backing up toward the swimming pool until it was too late. Still holding the cord, Bill plunged into the water. Someone totally submerged and holding a live electrical cord should be severely burned and shocked, if not electrocuted. Furthermore, Bill's boss had just checked the main switch, and it was working fine, but nothing happened to Bill. Still holding the cord, he swam to the side and climbed out unharmed. "Bill, what happened? Are you all right?" Astonished, the men suspected the cord and the outlet. Inspected it. Power was definitely flowing through them. No one could imagine how Bill had escaped serious injury. But when Martha heard the story, she realized its spiritual significance. "I knew then that I could safely give my son into the Lord's hands," she says. "I will always be grateful for this special example of his power and protection." Next one. Jim called radio station WYLL in suburban Chicago about a friend, Norma, for whom he had been praying. Norma, a single parent, was estranged from God and living a reckless life. She worked as a cashier, but was perpetually stressed and in debt. One night, things got to be too much for Norma, Jim related, and while she was closing her register, she stole $400 and put it in her purse. Heart pounding, Norma got to her car without being caught, but when she turned her key in the ignition, nothing happened. She had just had the car fixed. It couldn't be. Not another debt. Norma felt as if her world were caving in. She looked around the parking lot for help. Usually there were several co-workers pulling out, but tonight, oddly, the area was completely deserted. She had no one to call on, no one except... Norma put her forehead on the steering wheel. "God," she prayed silently, "I haven't been close to you, haven't given you a thought in a long time. But for some reason I seem to feel your presence. Please guide me now." She waited a moment, then slowly got out of her car. Walking back into the building, she found her boss. "Here," she said, handing him the $400. "I made a mistake." Her boss looked at the cash, then at her. "I see," he said slowly. "Well, I'm glad you discovered it." They smiled at one another, and Norma felt her heart lift. She could have been fired, even arrested, but for some reason her boss had faith in her. Maybe she could have faith in herself too. Maybe it wasn't too late to start living God's way instead of her own. Norma went back to her car and tried starting it one more time. The engine roared. Next, Martha Malum and her husband Howie were in Arizona visiting their son and daughter-in-law and grandchildren. I poured a mug of freshly made hot chocolate and put it on the kitchen table for Howie, Martha recounts. Engrossed in conversation, none of the adults saw 18-month-old John Paul toddle over, reach up and grab the container by the handle. He tilted it, and the scalding coffee cascaded out of the mug toward his upturned face. Everyone froze in horror. Then suddenly the steaming liquid changed course mid-air. The coffee went flying at a 45-degree angle, completely missing John Paul's face, Martha says. It landed with a huge splash on the kitchen floor and covered everything nearby, yet not even a drop touched his clothes. Who placed a protective yet invisible barrier around this little boy? Martha thinks she knows. Next, falls or potential falls seem tailor-made for the suspension of physical law. While going through a difficult pregnancy, a young woman tripped at the top of the flight of stairs. In the first split second, she panicked, sure that she would fall and lose her unborn child. Then everything went into slow motion, she reports. I glided down the stairs. It was like falling through heaven. She landed as if on a pillow. And when their son was born 3 months later, we named him Nathan, which means gift of God in Hebrew. Barbara Gove was visiting her brother in Milton, New Hampshire, when her 14-month-old nephew Eddie jumped off a truck parked in the yard. Eddie started to scream in agony. Horrified, Barbara saw that he had landed on a board with a nail in it, and the nail was now almost all the way through his foot. Eddie's dad was at work, and there was no one else at home. What should she do? Barbara lifted her sobbing nephew into her arms. The board and nail was still attached to his bleeding foot. Carried him to her car and drove him to the nearest hospital, praying all the way. Brakes screeching, she pulled into the parking space, picked Eddie up again, and hurried toward the emergency room entrance. As I carried him along the sidewalk, I heard a woman scream as we passed, Barbara says. I didn't have time to stop and ask her why, so I just kept going. Eddie was awfully heavy, but Barbara finally managed to get him indoors and hand him over to a nurse. Then, as she stopped to catch her breath, she realized that the woman had followed her into the hospital. Were you screaming at me outside? Barbara asked. Yes, said the woman, pale and shaken. Maybe I'd better show you why instead of telling you. The woman led Barbara back outside and showed her a large grate in the cement, almost the width of the sidewalk. It covered an opening where packages were dropped to the hospital basement. The grate was exactly where Barbara had walked, and it was open. I was sure you and the boy would fall right into that hole, and that's why I screamed, the woman said, but both of you seemed to actually float right over it. Barbara was astonished. How could this be? She knew her feet had never left solid ground. But later Eddie told her that he too had a floating sensation, and she carried him in her arms. And despite the doctor's concerns, his foot healed in just a few days, with no infection or after effects. Next, in 1987, Clem and Julie Walters went with their friends Sharon and David on a trip to Europe to celebrate the Walters' 13th wedding anniversary. Due to some research Julie was conducting, their major stop would be the childhood home at the convent of Saint Teresa, the famous Catholic saint, because they had been busy with pastoral activities in their prayer community during the days preceding the trip. We were not well prepared, Glim recalls. We didn't speak any foreign languages, and we were using passes, which can be confusing. We were on a bare bones budget, which didn't allow for mistakes, so we decided to pray our way along. Each morning, the four would join hands, dedicate the day to God, and ask Him for protection and guidance. Things went more smoothly than they had expected. On their way from Rome, problems began. Due to heavy rains, the train was delayed almost 20 hours, and when it finally reached the station, it was a madhouse. The four were on a tight time schedule due to various tickets that couldn't be exchanged, and now they had only a few hours left to visit before the boarding a ferry to cross the English Channel. The women set out to find a map so we could locate the sites without delay, Clem recalls. David and I stayed at the station to make a ferry reservations by phone. Since the men were unfamiliar with French coins, they couldn't operate the payphone. They asked several people for help, but received only grunts or head shakes. Time was passing, and the convent was sure to be closing soon. Then an attractive, well-dressed young woman went to the phone next to them and in rapid French had a quick conversation. "Do you speak English?" Clem asked her as she hung up. She turned to him with a radiant smile. "Of course I do," she answered. "How can I help you?" Clem was surprised. Her English was flawless. Quickly he explained their need for reservations. The kind young woman made the call for him. It was all taken care of, she said as she hung up. "This is wonderful. Thank you so much," the men began to say. "No need," she smiled over her shoulder as she walked briskly out of the station. "Enjoy your holiday." The two men followed, relieved. Already they could see Julie and Sharon standing outside a small shop, talking to an older woman. This woman, though speaking no English, had been able to help Julie and Sharon buy the correct map. Moreover, she knew the route to the convent and wanted to drive them there. The woman had tried to explain that they could not go without their husbands, and perhaps she would not feel comfortable taking two men along. She had not understood and was still trying to persuade them. It would be wonderful to ride with her. It would save so much time, Julie said. She was becoming concerned about missing her research opportunity, but we can't bring you men along without her permission. Clem didn't know what to do. Just then the young woman from the train station appeared at his side. Where had she come from? "May I help?" she asked. "You are becoming a lifesaver," Clem told her, and quickly explained. The two French women conferred. "She would be happy to drive all of you," the young woman finally translated. "Oh, wonderful," Julie explained. Clem grabbed his camera. "Before we go, let me get a photo of you four women," he said, and quickly snapped a shot. Then the young woman melted away into the crowd, and the older one guided them toward her car. The couples did reach St. Teresa's childhood home shortly before it closed, and Julie was able to complete her project. The rest of the trip was pleasant, and the four often commented on the arrival of the young woman in the train station. Without her help, they would have been ruined. When they returned to Indiana, Clem took his roll of film to the developer. One night he sat down to look at them. He had a used good camera, and all the photos came out well, except the few he had taken. Something had blurred and darkened them, and the scenes were barely visible. It must have been a bad roll of film. Clem threw them into his wastebasket. Later he had second thoughts. Why should those shots be ruined when everything else on the same roll before and after came out fine? Curious, Clem dug through the negatives and found the spoiled ones. He could see the scenes quite clearly in the negatives. Here was the snap of Teresa's convent, another of her childhood home. Clem held up the next negative, the one he'd taken of the 4 women standing in front of the little store. His skin prickled. There was no mistaking the pose or the background, and the little group was perfectly centered, but there were only 3 women on the negative, Julie, Sharon, and the older woman, who had given them a ride. Where the young woman had stood, there was no image at all. We were never able to get an actual photo developed from that negative. It just never took, Clem says. Perhaps angels have that effect on cameras. But Clem has no doubt they were surrounded by heavenly help on that special trip, and still are. No problem is too minor for God. I don't know about you guys, but that last one was long and boring. But I hope you guys enjoyed the others, and good night, guys.